5 a.m., the 31st of March 1947, Sapporo Prison's death row. 6 guards stood frozen before an empty cell. The bolt was still locked, yet the condemned inmate, Yoshie Shiratori, had vanished. The final clue was a broken soup bowl lying abandoned on the floor. The most terrifying part: this was his 4th escape. A criminal record so insane it became a legend. In 1936, he neutralized a complex lock with a rusty piece of wire in a brief 15-minute shift change. By 1942, he had spent 6 months using his own saliva to rot the window frame, disappearing into a stormy night. The climax came in 1944, when he dislocated his joints, contorting his body to squeeze through a 10 centimeters wide food slot. Chains and guns couldn't hold him, yet a single act of kindness made him voluntarily return to prison. What was that strange act? How one man could defeat Japan's most advanced prison systems, we first need to understand his profile and the legal trap of 1930s Japan. Forget concepts of human rights or justice. That era was known as the age of hostage justice. Simply put, it was a system where the conviction rate was 99%. Once the police dragged you into an interrogation room, your fate was sealed. You had only 2 choices: sign a confession or become a corpse. Prisons of that time were designed to crush any will to resist. And Yoshie Shiratori was the unlucky soul thrown directly into that meat grinder. Looking at his initial record, Shiratori showed no signs of being a criminal legend. Born in 1,907 inches, the harsh region of Aomori, Shiratori was just a poor tofu seller who later became a fisherman on a Russian vessel. Through this, he honed special skills that would later become weapons the guards could never have anticipated. It was the ability to lie perfectly still, waiting for hours in the most extreme weather. But his most fearsome weapon was his own body. His joints were loose, dislocating and relocating at will, a legacy of years of grueling labor. Driven to desperation, he turned to gambling and theft. In 1933, Shiratori was caught. He was apprehended for theft, but was also charged with murder. He was brutally tortured in the interrogation room. No evidence, no logic, only clubs and flesh-tearing whips. Torture followed torture. Finally, Shiratori broke. He tremblingly signed a confession, accepting a death he did not cause. A life sentence in Aomori prison was handed down in 1936, but it was in Aomori that the story truly began. Aomori prison did not hold Shiratori in the usual way. They treated him like an animal to be tamed. The guards turned their night shifts into private executions. He was woken every hour, doused with cold water, and beaten for no reason other than a look of disobedience. The endless torture drained his strength but awakened a wild survival instinct within him. His mind underwent a complete transformation. He had to escape this hell, not to evade justice, but to flee from death itself. The warm-up. Look at the prison's operational procedure. Strict and brutal, but Shiratori saw a flaw. He discovered a deadly silence. At exactly 5:30 a.m., the shift changed. For 15 minutes, the noisy greetings and careless inattention left the corridor completely unsupervised. His weapon was not a gun or explosives. He defeated the Empire's entire security system with a piece of wire from a wooden water bucket. He stole it, hid it in his mouth, between his toes, and passed every body search. Every night, he took out his treasure and practiced with the lock. At exactly 5:30 a.m. on the 15th of June, 1936, after the guards had passed, Shiratori acted. His hands were stiff, but his movements were precise. He inserted the wire into the lock. The bolt slid open. But Shiratori didn't run immediately. He knew the cell check was at 6 a.m. He needed to buy more time. He removed the loose floorboards under the tatami mat, arranged them in the shape of a person, and covered them with a blanket. In the dim morning light, a guard looking through the peephole would only see a sleeping prisoner. A highly effective diversion. He had 3 days of freedom, just 3 short days before being caught while looking for medicine at a hospital. But the price of those 3 days was a slap in the face to the Empire. They felt humiliated. And of course, they swore to throw him into a worse, more fortified place. But they didn't know that the greater the challenge, the more the legend of Shiratori was just beginning. A cruel paradox. Every time he was caught, they threw Shiratori into more secure cages, using more brutal whips. But strangely, the pressure didn't crush Shiratori. It only made him evolve. The tougher the prison, the more masterful his escape skills became. His transfer file to Akita was stamped in bright red, especially dangerous. As a natural reaction of cowardly guards, fear turned into brutality. Here, Shiratori was thrown into a masterpiece of carceral engineering. A solitary confinement cell with a 3-meter-high ceiling and 4 walls lined with smooth, slippery copper. A deadly surface with no friction, where even a lizard would slip and fall. The guards boasted that this would be the tomb to bury the legend, but they made a fatal mistake. They underestimated Shiratori's survival instinct. They didn't understand that when you push an intelligent man to the brink and strip him of all hope, you don't destroy him. On the contrary, that very brutality forged him, awakening the wild survival instinct within. From a petty thief, Shiratori had been trained by the prison itself into a master escape artist. Their own harshness taught him how to escape. Shiratori proved their arrogance to be foolish. Facing the smooth copper wall, he discovered a basic law of physics. Friction is born from pressure. Every night, he stripped naked, pressed his hands and feet firmly against the 2 opposite walls, turning his body into a living spring to inch his way up to the ceiling. His target was the skylight. The bars were solid, but the decaying wooden frame around it was the weak point. Shiratori used the only weapon he had left: saliva. Night after night, he patiently spat biological acid and warmth onto the wooden joints. A silent war waged for 6 months, rotting the frame from the inside, right under the guards' noses. On the night of the 15th of June, 1942, a summer storm raged. The sound became the perfect cover. At 2:15 a.m., Shiratori ripped the wooden frame apart. The escape route was open, but the gap was too narrow. This is when he used his contortion skills. Shiratori dislocated his shoulder, compressed his ribcage until his lungs were empty of air. He turned himself into a boneless creature to slide through the deadly opening. He disappeared into the rain, leaving behind a humiliated security system. Yet, the man who conquered copper walls and iron bars fell to something more fragile: trust. 3 months later, Shiratori appeared at the home of Kobayashi, the only head guard who had ever shown him kindness. In a ragged state, he wanted Kobayashi's help in surrendering to expose the prison's crimes. He believed in the conscience of a man in a guard's uniform. A deadly naivety. The moment Shiratori stepped into the bathroom, the dignified benefactor coldly picked up the phone and called the police. The plan for justice collapsed. Shiratori was handcuffed, carrying with him the most expensive lesson of his life: never seek humanity in those paid to rule over cages. The price for his previous escape was an additional 3 years on his life sentence. At the trial, Shiratori made a request that sounded pathetically naive. He asked to be transferred to Tokyo because he couldn't stand the cold, but the response was the empire's cold brutality. Justice of that time had no room for mercy. The judge's gavel fell, and the new sentence was not just time, but a one-way ticket to hell: Abashiri Prison. If Americans considered Alcatraz an inescapable fortress, for the Japanese, that title belonged to Abashiri. Located in the far north of Hokkaido, where winter temperatures regularly plummeted to -34 degrees Celsius, -30 degrees Fahrenheit, the message was clear: go ahead and escape. Mother Nature will kill you. 5.5-meter granite walls, densely packed watchtowers, and dogs trained to smell blood in a blizzard. And yet, their cruelty was revealed in a sick detail. They smeared whale oil on the walls and floor of his cell, turning the room into a permanent, slippery trap. In October, winter arrived. Inside the 4 stone walls, Shiratori's breath crystallized into snow in midair. The guards refused to give him a blanket. They wanted him to die slowly. Shiratori's body was forced to consume its own muscle to maintain a little body heat. Surprisingly, this became the very weapon that helped Shiratori escape later. The sub-zero temperatures made the metal contract. The food slot on the iron door, the only connection to the outside world, had warped in the cold, revealing microscopic vulnerabilities. And this is where it gets most horrific. Imagine the pain of a conscious man dislocating his own shoulder. But the shoulder wasn't enough. He forced his collarbones to overlap, compressed his rib cage until his lungs collapsed, pushing his heart into a state of oxygen-deprived hibernation. His spine bent at an inhuman angle. His hip ligaments stretched like a bowstring about to snap. He turned himself into a malleable mass of flesh to squeeze through that tiny opening. On the 3rd of November 1944, Shiratori had fasted for 5 days to shrink his stomach. He pushed his head through the slot. The sound of bones scraping against steel echoed in the quiet night. 20 minutes of physical torture. And then, a horrific sound. His hip ligaments tore, but he was out. The final challenge was the security fence. And ridiculously, the tool to destroy it came from the prison's own kitchen, a bowl of miso soup. Shiratori had secretly saved it for weeks. He used the friction of his hands to melt the frozen soup block, then poured the salty liquid onto the -30-degree fence bolts. Physics was exploited. The thermal shock caused the metal to expand suddenly, and combined with the brittleness of poor-quality wartime steel, the bolts cracked. The gates of hell swung open. Shiratori dragged his mangled hip into the Hokkaido wilderness, leaving behind a shattered Abashiri legend. But life always knows how to mock people. After 2 years of living like a prehistoric man in abandoned mines, evading the most intense manhunts, the escape legend fell for a ridiculous reason. A watermelon. The post-war hunger drove him to steal a watermelon from a farmer. A scuffle broke out, and the farmer was killed. It was an accident, but for the legal system, bitter from being humiliated by him, this was a golden opportunity. Shiratori was caught again. This time, it wasn't a prison sentence. They sentenced him to death. In 1947, as all of Japan was transforming post-war, Shiratori's fate seemed sealed by the death sentence. At the Sapporo fortress, officials confidently boasted that they had decoded Shiratori's algorithm. Learning from previous painful slaps in the face, they established an unprecedented security matrix. 6 guards armed to the teeth to monitor a single man 24/7. The cell was a cast steel block, from the ceiling to the bars, far more fortified than the hell of Abashiri. Technically, they calculated it very carefully. They narrowed every gap to be smaller than the average human skull. Shiratori couldn't dislocate his skull. As long as his head couldn't get through, the security system would win. But it was this arrogant reliance on dry numbers that led them to make a ridiculously foolish mistake. They didn't handcuff the death row inmate. In the eyes of the arrogant guards, Shiratori was just a washed-up 40-year-old man, tired and waiting to die. As soon as he entered the cell, Shiratori started acting. He constantly looked up at the ceiling with a desperate expression, his eyes fixed on the ventilation shaft above. He played the part of a cornered animal desperately seeking an escape route above. This act hacked into the guards' brains, reprogramming their reflexes. He had led the 6 guards by the nose. They focused all their vigilance on the ceiling, carefully shining their lights on the skylight every night, while completely forgetting the floor right under their heels. While 6 pairs of eyes were engrossed in watching the harmless space above, Shiratori began his magic in the blind spot below. No hammer, no chisel. His weapons were so mundane they were absurd. A few spoons and forks and a ceramic miso soup bowl. Shiratori's genius lay in his material handling technique. He used the sharp edge of the ceramic bowl to pry and scrape at the wooden floorboards. A job that required the patience of a saint and absolute silence. After digging, he meticulously reassembled the floorboards to look exactly as they were. In the morning, the floor looked intact, fooling the sleepy guards. And the excavated dirt? He packed it tightly under the floor or hid it right in his mattress. The bed became a repository for evidence right under the guards' noses without anyone knowing. When winter arrived, Shiratori played his final card. He lay in bed, pretending to be bedridden with depression. In fact, that curled-up position in his blanket allowed him a discreet space to dig even in broad daylight. The guards gradually got used to the messy pile of blankets on the floor, a deadly habit. On that fateful morning, When the guards lost their patience and threw open the blanket to punish the lazy prisoner, they froze. No one was there. Underneath the dismantled floorboards was a dark tunnel leading to freedom. The lumpy things under the blanket were just a pile of camouflaged dirt and rotten wood. Shiratori had fooled them until the very last second. Shiratori didn't use muscle, as he did in Akita, nor the insane endurance of Abashiri. He used his intellect to turn a soup bowl into the key to freedom, transforming 6 armed guards into 6 clowns in his chess game. However, despite successfully escaping for the 4th time, 1,948 also marked the limit of a legend. At 40, this cat-and-mouse game had finally exhausted him. A year had passed since Shiratori tunneled his way out of Sapporo's death row. But freedom, for him now, was not glorious. It was exhaustion. One day, wandering in Kotoni Park in Sapporo, Shiratori collapsed onto a bench, his whole body trembling from hunger and cold. At that moment, a police officer on patrol happened to come by. In any previous scenario, this would have been the moment Shiratori would strike or disappear into the shadows. But the officer didn't draw his gun. He simply sat down next to him to take a break. He didn't see the most wanted fugitive in the empire. He only saw a wretched homeless man. And then, an act that would change the history of Japanese justice took place. The officer took out a pack of cigarettes, an extremely expensive luxury in the post-war inflationary period. He didn't keep it to himself. He took out a cigarette and offered it to the stranger next to him. Shiratori took the cigarette. The hands that had once broken steel bolts, that had dug through frozen earth, were now trembling violently. For 2 decades, every interaction he had with a police uniform was a club, a chain, a spit in the face. He was used to being hunted like a wild animal, but at this moment, for the first time in decades, a representative of the law treated him like a human being. He took a deep drag, letting the smoke fill his lungs. And with that smoke, his will to flee also vanished. He turned to the young officer and spoke the last words of his criminal life.
I am Yoshie Shiratori. I am the one who escaped from Sapporo prison last year.
It was a cruel and beautiful paradox of criminal psychology. 4 steel fortresses, tons of chains, smooth copper walls, and hundreds of brutal guards had failed to contain him. But in the end, the thing that defeated the monster and held him back was not a gun. It was just a cigarette and a little unconditional kindness. This time, the handcuffs clicked on his wrists again, but the situation had completely changed. It was no longer a chase between a cat and a mouse. It was a surrender. Shiratori's change in attitude, combined with the winds of reform blowing through Japan's post-war justice system, signaled a different end for the legendary escape artist. The 18th of June, 1948. Yoshie Shiratori's trial began. But this time, the game had completely changed. Japan was now under the administration of the Allied forces after its defeat in World War II. With the collapse of the empire, the old, harsh justice system was also dismantled. Unfamiliar concepts like human rights, due process, and presumption of innocence entered the courtroom for the first time. The Sapporo High Court did something unprecedented. They did not try Shiratori as a wild beast to be destroyed. They dissected his case file under the microscope of modern legal science, and what they found overturned all preconceptions. First, a reenactment of the 1933 crime scene. The lawyers and investigators proved that the death of the farmer Tanaka, the initial cause of the tragedy, was not a cold-blooded murder. It was the result of a chaotic scuffle, where Shiratori had acted in self-defense. Second, the motive for escape. The court acknowledged a painful truth. Shiratori was not fleeing the law. He was fleeing torture. The crisscrossing scars on his body were living proof of the brutality of the old prison system, which had pushed a man to the brink, forcing him to break the cage to save his own life. Third, behavioral data. This was the most important point. For 11 years, with 4 successful escapes from the most fortified places, possessing extraordinary physical strength and deadly skills, Yoshie Shiratori had never harmed or killed a single guard. Even when he had the opportunity, even when he had a weapon in his hand, he always chose to hide rather than attack. The psychological profile confirmed. He was not a violent killer. The final verdict, the judge's gavel fell, delivering a sentence that shocked the public at the time. Death sentence overturned. Instead, Yoshie Shiratori was sentenced to 20 years in prison. This was not just a legal victory for Shiratori alone. It was a milestone, marking the transformation of an entire justice system. After the trial, Shiratori requested to be transferred to Fuchu Prison in Tokyo. And here, a strange phenomenon occurred. At Fuchu, he was not chained, not beaten, and was treated with respect by the guards. In return, the king of escapes, the man who had caused hundreds of guards to lose sleep, became the most model prisoner. He never tried to pick a lock again. Why? Because Shiratori no longer needed to climb walls. For the first time in his life, those walls were no longer trying to kill him. Yoshie Shiratori accepted his sentence, maintaining the conduct of a model prisoner for the rest of his life in prison. The result of this rehabilitation was a parole order issued in 1961, just 14 years after his rearrest. For the first time, the concept of freedom for Shiratori was no longer an escape, but a legal recognition. He chose to return to Aomori, closing the circle of fate at the place where it all began, to reunite with his daughter, the only surviving relative of a family shattered by years of imprisonment. In the public eye, Shiratori became an anti-hero, a living legend of the will to be free. Conversely, for the Bureau of Corrections and Japan's security system, the name Shiratori will forever be a painful scar, a testament to the powerlessness of steel walls against an extraordinary intellect. The case file on Yoshie Shiratori is closed, but his legacy continues to haunt to this day. His story is a powerful slap in the face to the old militaristic prison system, exposing the naked truth that violence only begets monsters. When you push people to the brink with cruelty, you inadvertently create uncontrollable, extraordinary abilities. Shiratori's journey leaves an immortal lesson about freedom, that all chains in this world are ultimately just material. You can build smooth copper walls, forge heavy shackles, or seal every exit with cold steel. But no prison is strong enough to contain a will to survive. His extraordinary intellect and instinct helped him conquer the most brutal hells on earth. But in the end, that man voluntarily stopped for one thing only: the kindness of the human heart. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because this brilliant escape is just the beginning of the breathtaking mysteries about human limits that we will decipher together. And I am Noir. See you in the next case file.